Yo, what is up? How you guys doing? My name is Priyanshu, and today I'm going to talk about podcast. Specifically, my top 5 favorite podcast, which I enjoyed listening to over and over again. So, 2 years back, when the lockdown scene happened in India, at that time I have actively started listening to podcast. And over the period of 2 years, I have listened to more than 100 different type of podcasts from all different categories, like categories from comedy to technology to business to psychology to true crime to social and cultural and many more. And out of these hundreds of podcasts, I have selected 5 podcasts, which according to me is my top 5 favorite podcasts. But before getting into the list, if you're someone new to this podcast culture, then for them I want to say that podcasts are something which you can listen to anytime, anywhere, doing anything. You just need a wireless earphones, and after that, you can listen to a podcast while doing your daily household activities, like while having your food, while walking, or when you are in your washroom, or whenever you are feeling bored, you can listen to a podcast. So, with this, let's get into the list of my favorite top 5 podcasts. So, the number one is WTF with Mark Maron. So, this podcast is my absolute favorite in the category of comedy podcast. So, Mark Maron is a famous comedian who sits down with various actors, directors, musicians, authors, comedians, and individual from all walks of life. So what Mark does is he invites his guest to his home in a comfortable sitting, and he asks them question in an interview style format, and questions are related to their life, their journey, their stories, their experiences, and many more. And the best part about this podcast is Marx makes the guest very comfortable, and he himself is a comedian and he's very funny. So you will feel while listening to their conversation that the conversation is really authentic, and because of the humor of Mark Maron, the conversation also become very funny, and you will not feel bored while listening to this podcast. So WTF with Mark Maron, highly recommended. Okay, so the next podcast is Stuff You Should Know. So based on the name, it is pretty obvious what this podcast is all about. Stuff You Should Know is hosted by Josh and Chuck, and they teaches you about different stuff that you should know. And trust me, the topics which they cover are really fascinating, and also there are few topics which you might have never heard before. Some of the topic they cover includes champagne, Satanism, LSD, El Nino, true crime, chaos theory, and the list goes on and on. So this show is a must on your playlist. Highly recommended. So the next podcast is My Favorite Murder. So true crime is one of my favorite categories of podcast whenever I'm feeling bored, and My Favorite Murder is one of the best podcast in that category. So the host of the show, Karen and Georgia, share their favorite true crime stories and also hometown crime stories which they gather from their friends and families. And trust me, the vibe of this podcast is insane, and the stories which they share are really amazing. So if you are interested in true crime stories, then this podcast is the best in that category. And even if you are not a fan of true crime stories, then also you should give it a try. This is a very good podcast. The next podcast is Today Explained. So I think everyone out there wants to gather all the latest updates and happenings around the world, but the typical basic style news podcasts are really boring, and you can hardly listen to those podcasts for 10 minutes. They're really boring, but this podcast is different. This podcast is hosted by Sean Rameshwaram, and he explains about daily news and updates, but in a journalistic and narrative feel. And Sean does an incredible job pulling listener to his stories and guide them through different voices who come onto his podcast and share everything that is happening around the world. So this podcast, highly recommended. And last but not the least, How I Built This. So again, this is one of my favorite podcasts to binge on. The podcast is hosted by Guy Reyes, and he explores how entrepreneurs, idealists, innovators have built their businesses, their ideas, their movements, and much more. So, if you're someone who is interested in startups and business, then you should not miss this podcast. And the kind of knowledge which you will get after listening to this podcast is insane because all the guests are successful in their respective fields, and you will get a lot of insight. Like, suppose if you want to build your own startup or you want to start your own business, then there are many conversations with startup founders and businessmen, and you will find those conversations really helpful and you will definitely learn something new. So this podcast highly recommended. So boys and girls, my list is completed. Now you guys tell me in the comment section what are your top 5 favorite podcast, and also if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. I will see you in the next video. Priyanshu out.